Second part. And we're very grateful to Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who has kindly sent a greeting to us, and we would like to invite you to listen to his brief greeting before beginning the second part.
Hi, everybody. Cardinal Timothy Dolan here, coming to you from right behind St. Patrick's Cathedral. I was thrilled when I heard that there's a symposium on Dorothy Day in the Eternal City, the city of Peter and Paul in Rome. And I'm delighted to greet all of you. I wish I could be there with you. This is appropriate because Dorothy Day, yeah, we're really proud of her here in the Archdiocese of New York. She was one of us. She walked our streets. She worshiped in our churches. She tended for the poor and advocated for peace and justice here in New York. But she belongs to the world. Dorothy Day belongs to the world. She belongs to the Church Universal. And we look for the day when the Church Universal can recognize that by beatifying her, the first step towards canonization. Thanks for doing it, everybody.
So yes, she does belong to the world. So good afternoon and welcome to the second panel of our academic symposium on the legacy of Dorothy Day. In the next hour, we will be enlightened by Professor Kevin Ahern and Professor Diego Alonso-Lasheras on her social action. I guess you think you know the story. You don't. The real one's much more gory. Roald Dahl's opening of Cinderella is a perfect introduction to Dorothy Day's legacy, if we change gory with holy. There are so many insights on social action that Dorothy Day leaves us today. To give some examples, the role of information. If information is not accessible to all, it fails in its nature and freedom. The role of literature. Who we are also depends on what we imagine. The difference between justice and care. Dorothy Day's pilgrimage is a crucial reflection on this, a reflection of disconcerting relevance today. Moreover, she reminds us the need to keep asking ourselves what the Church's priorities are today, and so as members of the Church, which are ours. Dorothy Day reminds us the need to continue fighting misogyny in the Church. She wrote in the 60s, "Women are no longer accepting their lack of status in the Church." Well, where are we now? In Rome, she has the feeling of not being listened to, the impression that the Church is not so interested in lay women. Again, where are we now? This year, we recalled a lot of important historical anniversaries, among them the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as we heard before. Well, how is memory made? Winners, all the winners, hold the enormous power to shape historical account and the memory of events. And a false memory means a false present, and therefore a future with a false hope. Dorothy Day has a lot to say on this as well. So, in order to try to live the gospel here in this world, in order to try to be fully Christians and fully citizens, let's embrace Day's legacy. When I went to Mary House in New York, I asked to see her room, the room where Dorothy wrote, prayed, loved, where she died. The answer was, well, we have to ask Jack, or whatever was the name of the man who was sleeping there. This answer is Dorothy Day. If we wish, and at least I wish, Dorothy Day to be a saint, not a holy card, she will not be only an American saint. So let's make this woman read and experienced by non-Americans as well. You can't understand Dorothy Day, her social action, if you don't understand the Catholic worker, whose roots stretch on both sides of the ocean. And it's Dorothy Day that frequently reminds us that Peter Moran is much more than a funny old man with a strong accent. So, going back to the other side of the Atlantic, please welcome Professor Kevin Ahern, is a theological ethicist and professor of religious studies at Manhattan University, where he directs the Dorothy Day Center for Social Catholicism. He has published several books and is the past president of 2 international lay movements. Professor Ahern serves as the board chair of the Guild for the Canonization of Dorothy Day.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be here at the Gregorian. Thank you to our hosts here for welcoming us. One of our hopes with this symposium is to get students in the room, and I'm so happy to see many students from different countries here. And following on what Giulia was just saying, I hope this is an invitation for us to see more research on what Dorothy might mean to your own context outside the United States. So we hope that we can see some research done on that, on Dorothy and her legacy. So I want to talk this afternoon about what it means for Dorothy's legacy in relation to the development of the Church's witness against nuclear weapons, but also the Church's witness on pacifism. 60 years ago, on November 4th, 1965, a dramatic scene unfolded in Union Square. On stage, 5 young men, including Thomas Cornell of the New York Catholic Worker, whose 2 children join us today, and one of his grandchildren, burned their draft cards in an illegal act of resistance to the Vietnam War. Among those supporting the young men that day was Dorothy Day. In her speech, she denounced, quote, the immorality of war, and then she reminded the crowd that Jesus commanded us to, quote, love our enemies, not to take the lives of men, women, and children, young and old, by bombs and napalm and all of the other instruments of war, end quote. This protest came only weeks after Dorothy's own act of nonviolent resistance here in Rome. In October 1965, she joined a group of women in a 10-day fast, praying that the Second Vatican Council would condemn nuclear weapons. Dorothy arrived in Rome with special issues of her Catholic Worker paper that she printed for that purpose to distribute amongst the Council Fathers, and met with a number of them during her time here. On October 8th, Bishop Pierre Bollin of Verdun, France, drew attention to the group of women in the deliberations on Schema 13. In December, Dorothy wrote of her joy in hearing the, quote, happy news that her prayers were answered with paragraph 80 of Gaudium et Spes, which condemned, quote, any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities as a crime against God and man, God's self, right? Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities. We might think about that in other contexts today. 6 decades later, the Catholic doctrine on war has continued to develop, moving away from a nearly exclusive position adhering to just war to what scholars and activists today describe as just peace. In his World Day of Peace messages and in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis not only advanced a more cautious position to war, but also offered the most explicit endorsement of gospel nonviolence. While this development certainly validates Dorothy's own readings of the gospel, can we discern anything more? Did this peace activist and grandmother actually help to advance Catholic doctrine on war? In other words, did Dorothy, in both style and substance, contribute to what Gordon Zahn described at one point as Catholic social thought from below, changing this doctrine from below? Dorothy's impact on Catholic social teaching owes much to her distinctive style. In her book, Prophetic in Public, The Social Witness of U.S. Catholicism, Kristen Heyer, who's a professor at Boston College, distinguishes between 2 styles of Catholic social engagement. A public style employs the principles of Catholic social teaching as a basis for formal engagement with government officials and participation in conventional political channels. Examples here include letter writings to elected officials and the Church's engagement with the United Nations. The prophetic style, by contrast, works outside traditional structures to denounce injustice and challenge those in positions of power through direct action and moral witness. Examples here include actions of civil disobedience, like the picture here of Dorothy's last arrest with the farm workers in California. Dorothy Day embodied this prophetic approach, often in ways that put her at odds with both the institutional church and government officials. Many church leaders in the Archdiocese of New York simply did not know what to do with this exceptional woman whose approach to the works of mercy earned her a place on the FBI's list of most dangerous radicals. Day's rejection of war predated her 1926 conversion to Catholicism. After her conversion, she sought to synthesize her social commitments with her newfound faith. Central to this synthesis were the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, the lives of the saint, which we heard about earlier, and the emergent theology of the mystical body of Christ as advanced by the Jesuit Emil Mersch in the wake of the First World War, and later articulated by Pope Pius XII in his encyclical During the Horrors of the Second. When Dorothy and Peter launched the Catholic Worker in 1933, pacifism was not the immediate focus. Within a few months, however, the paper soon took stances opposing class warfare and both sides of the Spanish Civil War. As World War II loomed, Dorothy wrote several articles reaffirming her pacifist position. In June 1940, she addressed the question, quote, what if we are invaded? And she responded by saying, we say again that we are opposed to all but the use of nonviolent means to resist such an invader. She confronted this issue more directly in her January 1942 editorial after Pearl Harbor. Quote, we are still pacifists. Our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount, which means that we will try to be peacemakers. Speaking for our many conscientious objectors, we will not participate in armed warfare or making munitions or by buying government bonds to prosecute the war or by urging others to do so in this effort. This stance cost the Catholic Worker dearly in subscriptions and in some committed members leaving. As World War II concluded, Dorothy's prophetic stance took on a new urgency with the advent of nuclear weapons. Her September 1945 editorial, which we have celebrated that anniversary this year, offered a scathing critique of the atomic bomb and President Truman, making her one of the first prominent Catholic voices to oppose the new weapons. This was not abstract moralizing. Dorothy understood that nuclear weapons represented a qualitatively different kind of violence, one that threatened not just combatants, but all of humanity and creation itself. In the 1950s, her opposition moved from words to action through civil disobedience. On June 15, 1955, 29 pacifists, including Dorothy Day and Eamon Hennessy of the Catholic Worker, were arrested in City Hall Park for defying mandatory civil defense drills. Over the next 6 years, Day would be arrested 4 more times, serving a total of 45 days in jail. While many bishops in the United States were focused more on the threats of atheistic communism, these actions raised consciousness about the immorality of nuclear weapons and the dangers of normalizing the preparations for nuclear war. By 1961, thousands joined in these protests and the drills were quietly discontinued. The publication of Pacem in Terris in 1963 inspired Dorothy that year a lot, and later that year she joined a peace pilgrimage to Rome to thank the Pope for his letter, and to ask the Pope that he have a more explicit condemnation of nuclear weapons, an effort that she would build upon 2 years later during her fast at the Council's final session. Dorothy's prophetic witness continued into the 70s, despite her declining health. In 1976, at the International Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia, speaking alongside Mother Teresa, Dorothy criticized the organizers for scheduling a mass that day for the armed forces on the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. In what would be her last public address, she drew attention to the profound links between the Eucharist and peace. So what, if any impact did any of this have on the development of social doctrine, on the church itself? Looking back, Dorothy's legacy in shaping official Catholic social teaching from below, even if indirect, can be seen in two areas. First, Dorothy helped to establish that faithful Catholics could legitimately adopt pacifism, including as conscientious objectors to military service. This has been promoted not only by the Catholic worker movement, but also with other movements associated with Dorothy, Pax Christi USA, and the Catholic Peace Fellowship. When Day founded the Catholic Worker in 1933, this position was far from clear. The Church's teaching on just war and obedience to the state were much better known than its tradition on nonviolence and the primacy of conscience. Bishops like Cardinal Spellman of New York championed efforts to resist communism and were very reluctant to support young Catholic men as conscientious objectors to the war in Vietnam. Following Vatican II, the US Catholic bishops affirmed the value of nonviolence in one of the first times it appears in a magisterial statement in their 1983 pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. In drafting the text, an example of the Church's public style, right, the public versus prophetic, the US Catholic bishops consulted Thomas Cornell, one of those draft card burners, and taught that pacifism was one of two morally legitimate positions for Catholics to take, alongside just war teaching. Significantly, the bishops named Dorothy Day alongside Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. as, quote, having a profound impact on the life of the Church in the United States through a renewed attention to nonviolence. More recently, Day's influence can be seen in the 2016 Nonviolence and Just Peace Conference, organized here in Rome by Pax Christi International. The conference echoed many of the themes from Dorothy's life, and its final statement drew attention to the value of gospel nonviolence and called the Church to move from a just war framework to a just peace tradition. I think some of you might cover this in some of your classes, potentially. While he did not go as far as to reject just war, Pope Francis clearly echoed the final statement in his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Nonviolence, a style of politics for peace, and later in Fratelli Tutti, where he taught that it is very difficult nowadays to speak of the possibility of a just war. In these developments, Day appears less as a radical outlier than a forerunner. Second, Dorothy's legacy challenges the Church to take seriously the movement for nuclear abolition. This effort has gained new momentum with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was supported and ratified by the Holy See, and with the strong support by Pope Francis, whose forceful teaching on the immorality of both the use and the possession of nuclear weapons is made clear in Fratelli Tutti. A leading voice in this effort has been Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico. In his 2022 pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, Wester cites Day and includes her in a list of suggested readings, and he has spoken about being inspired by her in memorial masses in New York, organized alongside UN meetings for the Treaty of the UN. Among the most striking efforts to channel Day's legacy in opposition to nuclear weapons has been the Plowshares movement, initiated by Jesuit Daniel Berrigan and his brother Philip Berrigan in 1980 to draw attention to nuclear weapons through acts of disarmament. While it is debatable if Day would have supported the limited destruction of property that characterizes the typical Plowshares action, the movement builds upon Dorothy's pacifist positions and her prophetic style of non-cooperation with the works of war. In the most recent Plowshare actions, one of Dorothy's granddaughters, Martha Hennessy, who is here with us today, joined 6 other activists in entering the Kings Bay submarine base on April 4th, 2018, to, quote, make real the prophet Isaiah's command to beat swords into plowshares. Like her grandmother in the civil defense drills, Martha believed that her conscience compelled her to defy the law, hoping that her trial and imprisonment might raise awareness to the destructive power of Trident nuclear submarines. In Gaudete and Exsultate, Pope Francis defined holiness in light of the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes he taught are like a Christian's identity card. But practicing them, following Jesus, is not easy, and often involves what Francis says as going against the flow. We live in a moment of escalating nuclear danger in a world marked by both indifference and interdependence. Russia and the United States have suspended participation in nuclear arms control treaties. China is expanding its nuclear arsenal, and the United States is considering restarting testing. Dorothy Day's prophetic witness on nonviolence and nuclear abolition challenges people of faith to go against the flow, to refuse the normalization of nuclear deterrence, to resist the silence that surrounds these weapons of mass destruction, and to insist that the possession of nuclear weapons is incompatible with the gospel. As her cause for canonization advances, perhaps the Church will finally receive the full force of her prophetic message, that in the nuclear age, pacifism is not a naive idealism, but a clear-eyed realism about what our weapons can do and what our faith demands us to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahern, for your presentation, reminding us all these aspects, urgent and incompatible with the gospel, about this woman, this peace activist, and this grandmother. Pointing out, I think it's very important, some concrete things that we can do. Dorothy Day has a lot to say on this as well. And please, now, coming back to this side of the ocean, please welcome Professor Diego Alonso-Lasheras, who gioca in casa, because he is a professor here at the Gregorian University. He teaches moral theology and courses on social ethics, specifically on religious freedom and the role of the Church in the international order. As a priest, he also develops some pastoral activities.
Thank you. You said che gioco in casa. I play in my own field, but I'm the only one who is not a native English speaker. I'm not an expert in Dorothy Day, so you will forgive me for my shortcomings. Okay. In his first apostolic exhortation, Pope Leo insists, which we had a month and a half ago, insists, quote, that all, quote, Christians come to appreciate the close connection between Christ's love and his summons to care for the poor, end quote. He further asserts that, quote, it is essential to insist on this path to holiness, for in this call to recognize him in the poor and the suffering, we see revealed the very heart of Christ, his deepest feeling and choices, which every saint seeks to imitate, end quote. The last part of this quote, the Pope is quoting Pope Francis on Gaudete and Exsultate that you quoted. So the last two popes insist that, holiness has to do essentially with love and care of the poor. And Benedict XVI, in the conclusion of his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, he ended up the encyclical by citing the example of, quote, human promotion and Christian formation intended above all for the poorest, which was first taken up by the monastic and mendicant orders, and then by the various male and female religious institutes throughout the history of the Church. Figures such as Francis of Assisi, Ignatius of Loyola, John of God, Camillus de Lelis, Vincent de Paul, Luis de Marillac, Joseph Carolengo, John Bosco, Luigi Orione, and Teresa of Calcutta remain outstanding models of social charity. I find it revealing that, in this beginning of the 21st century, all the popes have thought that it's important to insist that one trait of holiness it is to care for the poor, which is something, we've heard all the experts so far, so it's certainly something also very central to Dorothy Day's life. But I also think that Dorothy Day's life not only shows this care for the poor, but also unveils something which is important for Catholic social teaching. I do moral theology, social ethics, Catholic social teaching, and I think her life, like the lives of many saints, canonized or not, shows something important, which is what I'm going to develop here. Hans Urs von Balthasar, in a text on Thérèse de Lisieux, and we've heard that she was a favorite of Dorothy Day, and Elizabeth of Dijon, less known, but another Carmelite more or less of the same time. He affirms that holiness is something, Balthasar says, essentially social. And it is social because holiness is not a special gift from God to one person, to the person who receives that holiness, but a gift to the whole body that is the church. Especially in those cases, using von Balthasar's terminology, in which holiness is a particular holiness, opposed or to and not habitual holiness. There are saints who are habitual holiness. We cross their ways with them, thank God, every day, and they will never be canonized, but are holy people. But in case of particular holiness, he says their lives, and I would argue that this is certainly true in Dorothy Day's life, her lives present themselves as, he uses the word, a spectacle. And he says, I don't mean that in a theatrical or a cinematic representation, but in the etymological sense of the word, as something to be looked at. The life of every saint, canonized or not, is something that presents itself to be looked at, to be contemplated. And there are, and here I quote from Balthasar, examples of holiness which God himself sets as a milestone, as a distinctive sign, as valid explanatory models of his gospel for today, and sometimes perhaps even for future centuries, end quote. I would argue that this is the case with Dorothy Day and the entire movement that she basically, along with Peter Morin, began, whose life is an explanatory model of how to live the gospel and care for the poor by creating, participating, and living in structures of grace, because poverty is always the result of structures of misery, of structures of sin. Human misery is not just a fatality. Human misery, and in the recent apostolic exhortation, the Pope repeated this idea. We have poor people not because, some of us are born blonde and some of us are born with dark hair. No, we have poverty and we have misery because we have sin in the world. And I think, Dorothy Day's life helps us understand something about it, and it enriches the teaching. And could, Professor Pyle, you said that she anticipated Laudato Si by years. I would argue that she is an example of what I call, and Professor Ahern has a book about it, structures of grace. She anticipated also the idea of structures of sin and the opposing structures of grace. The concept of structures of sin entered the Catholic social teaching in Sollicitudo Rei Socialis with John Paul II in 1987. He said that these structures of sin are the sum of negative factors which act contrary to a true awareness of the universal common good and the need to promote it, creating in individuals and institutions an obstacle that it's difficult to overcome. This concept has really had, in circles of Catholic social teaching, a good reception. You do a Catholic social teaching 101 course, and they will talk to you about this concept. I think it also has allowed us to welcome it, because it helps Catholic conscience take into account the social dimension of all moral action. Catholic moral theology has been, I would argue, rightly accused of being too individualistic. When you go to confessions, you confess individual sins. You usually don't confess social sins. And certainly, I find it kind of interesting that Dorothy Day, again, is an example of someone, ahead of her time, trying to, with her life and her sacramental practice, going beyond this kind of moral individualism, partly because through the doctrine which she uses. She names it a lot and takes the consequence of the body of Christ. It's kind of one of these constant themes. But I believe the encyclical, not the encyclical, the reception of the encyclical has remained half of the way. Why? Because we talk a lot about structures of sin. It's good to talk about structures of sin, but Jesus Christ did not send his apostles to preach the gospel of sin and condemnation. Jesus Christ sent his apostles to preach the gospel of grace and salvation. And therefore, I would argue that there's a book by Professor Ahern that said, but one concept that in Catholic social teaching, that in Catholic ethics, we have to develop more is the idea of structures of grace, structures of grace. And what I argue today here is that I think Dorothy Day's life and the Catholic worker movement offers an example of how this can be done and how this is done. It's a spectacle in the sense that von Balthasar used it, in the sense. So the reception of structures of sin is insatisfactory. It's good, it's not bad, but I would argue it's insatisfactory because we have to receive it, but not stay there. I would argue we have to talk about structures of grace more. Lumen Gentium said that the church is in Christ as a sacrament. And I would argue that ecclesial bodies of different kinds are called to be in Christ as a sacrament, and therefore to confront with structures of grace the structures of sin that we find in this world, and of which sometimes we are part of. It's not something that is just out there of which we are pure and contaminated. Structures of sin we are sometimes part of. And the church's response to it is structures of grace, structures of grace. I would argue, if you look for a definition of structure of grace, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time. So I propose a working definition that is basically crafted as a photographic negative of what John Paul II says about structures of sin. So the sum of social relations infused with grace, which allow individual Christians and ecclesial bodies a true awareness of the universal common good and the need to promote it, creating in these individuals and institutions a new light and consciousness of the need of conversion and church reform. These structures are based on personal and communal experience of grace and therefore help individuals and communities to live more fully the gospel. I would argue, following also part of the book of Professor Ahern, that this happens at least in 4 ways. I guess we could always have more, but I mean, the first one is simple life according to the gospel, which we could term as, Christian witness. This person lives the gospel. So that's the first way in which we partake in structures of grace. The second way that structure of grace works is in a pedagogical way, by preaching in a certain particular way, teaching others with whom they come in contact how to live according to the gospel. And it's been said here, and it's very clear, I'm not an expert in Dorothy Day's writings and life, but, reading what I've been able to read, that there are a number of people who are not Catholic workers, but spend some time in the Catholic work and receive this pedagogical influence. Third, by denouncing prophetically what is sinful and against the gospel, and particularly in her pacifism, Dorothy Day was very prophetical. And fourth, transforming social structures that become somehow infused with charity and with love. Okay, that would be structures of grace. Structures of grace, I would say, always are, in a certain way, imply church reform. We, as Christians, are not living up to our baptismal call. And I mean, this is true for all of us. It's not pointing the finger to somebody else. It's just accepting that, we don't live the full our call in baptism. Something about church reform and how this shows up in Dorothy Day's life and the Catholic worker. In a very important book for Catholic theology by Yves Congar, he talks about true and false reforms in the church. And he mentions 4 conditions for reform in the church without a schism. The 4 conditions are the primacy of charity and pastoral care, remaining in communion with the whole, patient in respecting delays, and renewal is a return to the beginning of tradition, not to the tradition of some novelty, by mechanical adaptation, but by finding in the tradition the sources to renew the church. So it's not just jump up in the last fashion, which we could always fall into that defect, but finding in what might be a sign of the time how we respond to this, drawing on our tradition. And the church has a long tradition. Okay, I would argue that these 4 conditions for reform without schism are exemplified in Dorothy Day's and the Catholic worker movement, a way of working and being a structure of grace. And the last part of what I have to say has to do with this. Well, first, certainly Dorothy Day had difficult beginnings with the church, to put it mildly. She was not unaware or innocent of certain failures of the church, or if you want to be, we're in Rome, so you have to be careful with what you say, of the children of the church, not of the church, of the children of the church. And she says, I felt at the time that religion would only impede my work. She was moved for social reform and the plight of the poor. And she says, I wanted to have nothing to do with the religion of those whom I saw all about me. I felt that I must turn from it as from a drug. I felt it need to be an opiate of the people and not a very attractive one. So I hardened my heart. So her first encountering the church, she talks also, for example, of how she says, it's good to have hospitals and all these things, but, maybe we should ask ourselves, why do workers have working conditions that make them end up in those hospitals instead of just, maybe there are certain things that could be fixed without having to get to the hospital. So she has this first encounter, which I think it helps illuminate why the way she lived and the way she wanted to live is somehow church reform. It's participating, creating, living structure of grace that is church reform. That is church reform. She's also aware that by participating and being part of these structures of grace, things get to change. Maybe not dramatically, but things get to change. In the long loneliness, she says at the very end of part 2, and before she meets Peter Morin, so to speak, and begins the Catholic worker, she says, quote, "The years have passed and most of the legislation called by those workers is on the books now," because she's just come back from Washington, helping people who were basically asking for working conditions that today we think are just basically normal, but in those days, something you had to fight for, picket for. She said, I wonder, quote, "I wonder how many realize just now how much they owe the hunger marchers who endure fast and cold, who were like the Son of Man when he said, the foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head." So she's aware that, by participating in these structures of grace, things change, and, sometimes they do change for the better. Why I think that we can talk about Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker as structure of grace and church reform? Well, I guess it's very clear that the Catholic worker practices charity and pastoral care, and particularly through the works of mercy, So I won't stop there because I have limited time. But it's also interesting how pastoral care, the primacy of pastoral care seems to be part of the style, the way of acting. She describes Moring when she first met him, quote, "Peter made you feel a sense of his mission as soon as you met him. He did not begin by tearing down or by painting so intense a picture of misery and injustice that you burned to change the world. Instead, he aroused in you a sense of your own capacities for work, for accomplishment. He made you feel that you and all men had a great and generous heart with which to love God. If you once recognized this fact in yourself, you would expect to find it in others. The art of human contacts, Peter called it happily." End quote. So certainly a primacy of pastoral care. This is kind of a phrase that when I read, I thought, we should use this in courses of pastoral care and counseling. The ideas of houses of hospitality quickly caught on, and I put these woodcuts because they're the first woodcuts that the Bethune made for the Catholic worker. There were two pictures of the saints, but there were also a practice of the works of mercy. St. Catherine of Siena visiting the imprisoned, and St. John Bosco instructing the ignorant. And they realized that this was the way to give primacy to charity and pastoral care. Second condition for a true reform of the church, remaining united with the whole. We've just heard a lot about Dorothy Day's position on pacifism, but she remained united. She knew her position was not a majority position. I mean, she wasn't the only one, but it was clearly a minority position, and she respected very clearly, and I won't go on farther, this remaining united with the whole. even though I'm sure she sometimes was kind of not very happy with the position of some of the pastors of the church. Patient and respect for the delays. Her biographers talk about she grew more patient. You quoted, that she was, somebody's corrected her, said, you should tame your, she grew more patient. Maybe not enough, but even the saints could be patient. I like this phrase that I read in one of her biographies, that as she grew older, she started saying, somebody has to chop the vegetables, because in a Catholic worker house, or in Jesuit houses, for the same sake, somebody has to chop the vegetables, or, make sure that when you take the community card, you put gas after it. This just happens in Jesuit houses. I'm sure in other types of community, people leave always the car with the tank full. The last condition that, reading her life, I find happens is renewal happens through a return to the principle of tradition. So in Peter Morin's way of thinking, and in Dorothy Day's and the Catholic worker, I find, a lot of resonances with the liturgical movement. I mean, I don't think Peter Morin is a member of the liturgical movement, but I don't know if he received the influence or just resonated. I don't know, I'm not an expert in the life of Morin, but certainly in this idea that, the sacramental is the social, and the social is the sacramental. It resonates a lot, I would say, with Dorothy Day's life, which on the other hand, it's basically, I teach Catholic Social Ethics 101. I would argue that that's basically what the fathers of the church say. I mean, if I had to say, like in a line, what do the fathers of the church say about, social ethics? The sacramental is social, and the social is sacramental. This is not Dorothy Day, but another author says, and I like it, our social program is the Eucharist. Okay, I imagine that, if we had here Dorothy Day, she would more or less agree with this. To conclude, I would argue that, in Dorothy Day's life, the church finds a good example of how holiness goes along with beginning or participating in structures of grace, which at the same time are always a way of church reform. Structures of grace are, structures of grace are, ecclesial or church bodies that try to bring the grace of God to a certain place and social place. It's also always part of church reform, because the church always has to live to the full the calling that we have received in baptism.
Thank you, Professor Diego Alonso-Lasheras, for your presentation. You gave us a lot of insights on holiness, canonized or not, on grace, on sin, social sin. That's very interesting. We have a lot of patience with the church. I think the mothers of the church have a lot of patience. And it was very interesting, the accent you put on the idea of community. That is very important. It's not being by oneself, but it's the idea of community. Really, thank you to both our professors, because when Pope Leo recalled Dorothy Day some days ago, he talked about a woman of mind, heart, and hands. Heart and hands is something that traditionally we put besides women. Mind is not so obvious. So what these two presentations demonstrate the richness of this part even of Dorothy Day's legacy. I think we have some minutes left, yes, if there are some questions for our two professors, we are here. There is one, yes, up there. Thank you.
Very grateful to both the speakers. I am happy to be here listening to about a great Dorothy Day. My question goes to the esteemed speaker, Kevin. When you talk about when Dorothy condemned the war situations that happened in the past, and Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, when he talks about war, he says war is something that is constant threat, and that represents the denial of the rights of the people, and also it is the failure of humanity and politics. Now today, when we reflect and go through, the theology of today is a dialogue. It is a dialogue that we need to emphasize and go about in condemning the war and promoting peace. Is there any platform where Dorothy Day emphasized on this dialogue? I'd like to know more about that. Thank you.
Sorry, if there is another question. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Okay, I have two short questions, but big ones maybe. One is, obviously, we have the war in Ukraine and we had the conflict between Israel and Hamas this year, but these are a bit exceptional. Most of the wars we've had in these last 30 years are guerrilla warfare, terrorism, genocide, pogroms. So they're low-level conflicts sometimes, which are decades long with very basic weapons, but also sometimes they are organized criminalities or new forms of warfare. I don't know what Dorothy Day would say to this. I mean, so can we use non-violence, at least as was understood in the 60s, in the case like Rwanda or Srebrenica, or in the current situation in Sudan or with the Rohingyas and so on. So again, how do you resist a government like Iran, persecution of protests by women and so on? So I mean, I'd be interested if, because I'm a bit critical, and I think we need to be also creative in finding new ways of nonviolence, but also in maintaining also the other side, that we need to protect the victims, and sometimes we need to use, and this is the part of the just peace, that sometimes we need to intervene. The other question is on structures of grace. I mean, structures of sin I understand also as structures which are pervasive, like, I mean, a whole system of corruption within a country, where you can't do anything without a kickback. Why do structures of grace have to be ecclesial or immediately linked to the church? Because we're using the word grace, and there's no grace if there's no baptism? Or can there be grace also in things which are, government or in laws, in international movements which have nothing to do with the church? Okay.
Yeah, we need another symposium, but okay. Yes, maybe.
So, okay, really quick to the question, and maybe answer also Father René's question as well. I think that's an amazing question, and I think this is maybe something, I imagine you're coming from South Asia, where dialogue or interfaith, intercultural dialogue becomes much more pressing. If you look at Dorothy's life and her sources that she draws from, like her bedroom, it's full of books from many different sources and traditions. She's drawing from ideas from Russian poetry and writers who are non-Christian, and ancient texts and new texts, and it's this collection, beautiful collection. So in a sense, she regularly interacted with people who were not activists, thinkers, writers from the non-Catholic, non-Christian tradition, or interculturally with going and working with an African-American activist around a farm down in Georgia where she was shot at for her work, right? So that notion of dialogue, I think, is really present. But linking the two, I think, her answer to everything is personal responsibility. Right? So a lot of people, a lot of Catholic theologians, moral theologians, ethicists had debates over this 2016 Pax Christi conference, which said we should throw out completely the just war tradition. The church should never talk about just war ever again, only gospel nonviolence, because of Rwanda, because of these things. A lot of pacifists in the Catholic tradition argue, there's a book that says, what about Hitler? Right, this make-believe situation. Well, what if you were in Hitler? Well, when Dorothy was here in Rome protesting or fasting during the council, she met with this Jesuit who had, remind me his name, he was a British Jesuit who was bishop in Bombay. What is it? Archbishop Roberts, who had a cross, his pectoral cross had a relic inside of it of Franz Jägerstätter, the Austrian farmer who refused to participate, even if that meant his death. And as a parent, every time I watch the movie or read the books about Jägerstätter, I always cry. And my wife says, "You didn't cry at her wedding." But my question is, but as a parent, what do you do? Right? Are we willing to take a stand of personal responsibility? So every Sunday, I think it's every Sunday outside of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York or in other places, Catholic workers are outside asking for a stronger voice on Gaza, right? Catholic workers are going and asking for what is our personal responsibility in the face of conflict. So Dorothy wasn't thinking in those bigger terms, but others like us are thinking about the just peace as a framework that might include R2P or might include something like this, or police, and Mark Ullman and Tobias Winwright and others have written on that. But I think the personal responsibility is something we absolutely need.
Lumen Gentium says that, you can find elements of sanctification and salvation outside of the Catholic Church. So far from me that's not necessarily what I was saying. I was talking to an auditory which I think it's mostly Catholic. And I guess if there is someone of you who is not a Catholic, is because you're some type of other Christian denomination. I don't think we have a lot of non-Christians here. So, one crafts his speech depending on who do you have in front of you. But certainly there's a lot of greats outside of the church.
Okay, so thanks again. And now we have some other very important point of views to listen to. Thank you.